My name is Gordon Flake, and it's a great honor for me to moderate the first in these thematic plenary sessions. I anticipate we'll have a lot of colleagues who are getting coffee and tea and sneaking in to join us. But this panel is a wonderful opportunity to focus on the blue economy. I think everyone here knows that the Indian Ocean is the third largest ocean in the world, about 20% of the mass of the world's oceans, the warmest ocean. And in some respects, when it comes to economic activity, the organization surrounding it, while we're making up something probably the least regulated, the least understood, the least explored. So there's a lot of work to be done on this front. We sitting here in Western Australia, if you say, blue economy, people think crayfish and fishing from the shore, and a passageways for iron ore or LNG ships going up into Northeast Asia. But obviously, in the event of this Indian Ocean Conference and having a tremendous panel from throughout the entire Indian Ocean littoral, we have an opportunity to think a lot more expansively about blue economy. And I'm delighted that we have a magnificent panel to help us think through these issues. I will introduce them first and then turn to them in turn to give some initial opening remarks. And you all will have in the beautiful little briefcase given to you by the India Foundation kind of a list of the speakers and their bios, so I won't go into them in great detail, other than to say that our first speaker will be Ambassador Anil Wadhwa. He's well known here in Western Australia, played a very important role writing a counterpart to the Australia's India economic strategy, writing an Indian-Australia economic strategy, and has been a leader as a diplomat, as a thinker, as an academic, and a frequent visitor to Western Australia. So Ambassador Wadhwa, welcome back. Next, we're joined by Angela Williamson, who is a director of the Director for Blue Policy and Planning for the Blue Economy Cooperative Research Center here in Australia. Angela, thank you for joining us here. And then we have Marie-May Jeremy, the CEO of the Seychelles Conservation and Adaptation Trust in the Seychelles. Marie-May, thank you for coming. Timothy Walker from the Institute for Security Studies, Maritime Project Leader and Senior Researcher in South Africa. Thank you, Timothy. And last but certainly not least, Asha DeVos, founder of the Ocean Swell in Sri Lanka. I run the Perth US-Asia Center, and we just kind of group together US and Asia, so it's US-Asia. So I love the idea of Ocean Swell. So Ocean Swell, Swell, I'm not sure, but you'll tell us what we're doing going forward there. But anyway, what we're going to do is we really want to have a vibrant discussion. We've got some great people in the audience, delegates and others, a lot of expertise on the stage. I'm going to ask each of our panelists in turn just to open up 5 or 6 minutes of opening comments to kind of set the stage. I'll then ask a few questions, but I want to reserve as much time as possible for a conversation with you who are here as delegates to the Indian Ocean Conference. So Ambassador Wadhwa, over to you first.
Thank you, Gordon. It's a great pleasure to be back here in Perth again, and on a subject that is very, very important for the countries of the region. Let me just start by saying that, you rightly said that, as far as the ocean is concerned, many countries are turning to the ocean and the waters around them for their own livelihoods, because as our lives develop and become more complicated, it's becoming more and more important to exploit the ocean as much as we can. And we often forget that 50% of our oxygen comes from the oceans, and 30% of the carbon dioxide that we breathe out is then taken in again by the ocean. 97% of the water that we actually use and drink comes from the ocean. So therefore, it's very important to have a certain amount of balance in terms of how you exploit the resources that the ocean has to offer to us. And that's the starting point. And from there, if we look at what's happening around us, I think there are 5 or 6 areas that littorals, as we see them today, try to do is to improve their livelihoods and also become more prosperous as we progress further in life. Regardless of the fact at what stage of development countries are, they all like to do that. The first thing which comes to mind is, of course, fisheries and agriculture, because that's I mean, from time immemorial, the oceans have been used for that, to better livelihoods, and the people of the littorals have always relied on fisheries to improve their livelihood. But of course, we have to make sure that we have the new technologies which are available now with us in order to be innovative and to apply them. And for that, ocean science research therefore becomes more and more important. One can always argue that there's not a possibility for some of the countries who are not so well off in terms of their resources or their finances, but I'll come to that a little later. The second issue is tourism, because if you have sustainable tourism, you obviously need a lot of demands on the urban infrastructure and also the construction which goes in with it as far as improvement, your harbors are concerned, the maritime economy overall, coastal shipping, and in terms of the livelihoods, improving the livelihoods of the fisher folk who go out there into the ocean regularly. In these days of intense competition, you also have technological advancements in terms of how much you can exploit the ocean as far as fisheries are concerned. And therefore, the exploitation sometimes surpasses what is actually required. In fact, most of the time it does, depending on your capability. So that needs to be checked and taken into account as far as that part of development is concerned. Again, new technologies have come up in terms of recycling and cleaner technologies as far as pisciculture or fisheries is concerned, and those need to be applied. Again, we don't have technologies which are available freely to the countries of the so-called global south. And that is why it's so important to have important mechanisms in place where you share technology, but also at the same time, you have an institutionalization of how you share that technology. It's not easy to do that. Today we have a number of different organizations engaged in something which is very, very similar. So there is some sort of a duplication of effort which has happened. And that diffusion does not help anyone. And in the process, we have a situation where very selectively there is some amount of transfer of technology, but ultimately it's up to the countries themselves to create that capacity in order to be able to exploit that technology for their common benefit. And finally, Gordon, I'd like to make this point about finances, because we all talk about finances being available in terms of bodies like the United Nations in general, but also the regional organizations. How it is distributed in the end to countries who actually need them is the question. And there we haven't made much of a progress. I'm afraid it's a weak point where the availability of finance ultimately depends on how much organized we are in terms of its proper utilization, distribution, and mechanisms which are fair and also they're equitable in terms of how much is needed by the littorals. And in terms of the countries who can actually afford the latest technologies, we've come to a point where they overexploit what they have, are reluctant sometimes to share that with the others, and in some cases exploit what is available in the open seas, which is not their exclusive economic zone. There's a number of countries which indulge still in what we call IOU fishing, for example. And of course, we have a number of organizations looking at this question. A number of papers have been written about it, but we need proper utilization and institutionalization of how we actually regulate it and how we distribute these finances. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Wadhwa. Earlier today, I was speaking with someone who referred to you as an encyclopedia. I've heard you speak on critical minerals and investment more broadly, education, and now I hear you speak in such detail on the blue economy. So thank you so much for your remarks. Angela, obviously you heard Assistant Minister Watts today make a very strong statement that Australia is indeed an Indian Ocean country. We've got the entire western seaboard. We've also got Indian Ocean territories. Delighted to have an Australian perspective on the blue economy.
Yeah, thank you very much, and thank you so much for the invitation here. This is a really important topic, not just because it's in my title of my role and the organisation I work at, but it's so much more than that. I think that when we're looking at this roadmap ahead for the Indian Ocean countries and thinking about the context of WA and Australia more broadly, what we're really looking for is a pathway that's fair, that's just, that is sensible, that's contemporary, is ambitious, and at the same time is honest. I think it needs to set out and say what it's going to do, and then I think we need to be held to account and actually do those things and for it to work. It needs to be founded on our learnings to date, and I think we need to be really honest about what has and hasn't worked in the blue economy to date, and then also looking at what everyone else is doing. But we need to do this in a way that also acknowledges the changes going on around us, changes to nature, changes to the climate, and everything that comes along with that. If I talked about the seafood supply and the seafood industry, because it is a major part of the blue economy, you know, it really genuinely is, because it's food. It's food for consumption in environments, it's in communities, it's that livelihoods element, but it's also profitability as those products go into those global markets. But there are so many changes. You've got gear exclusions, fisheries closures, and I've got to read from this to make sure I don't miss these things, restructures, competing space with new and emerging and transitioning industries, whether it's offshore wind, ocean energy, rocket launch areas, desalination plants, cables, decommissioning of oil and gas platforms, carbon capture, blue carbon banks, the introduction of nature-based and of climate and nature financial disclosure. So the blue economy covers so many different aspects. Here in Australia, 40 years ago, the Australian Tourism Commission had a cracker of a tourism campaign. And I think Paul Hogan talked about, I'll slip an extra shrimp on the barbecue for you. The reason I raised this is at the time, I don't think anyone who was watching that looked at that particular product and wondered, was that shrimp wild caught or farmed? Is the impact of that growing it or catching it, has that been offset? Did the company who produced it have a decarbonisation pathway? Did they have an emissions reduction plan? Was it accredited? Was there a sustainability accreditation around that? Was there consent? And who gave that consent? Today, when it comes to the blue economy, people are asking those questions for not just prawns, for a number of ocean industries. Your retailers, your consumers, the community, the government, investors, and our lenders. And they're asking those questions all around the world. When it comes to the blue economy, aquaculture, for example, plays a really important role in food production systems. And we're told by the head of the UN that that role is going to become more and more important as we move forward. Spotlight, it's fair and square on the role of oceans for food production and energy production, just as our coastal areas are already spotted with land-based farms and increasingly seeing more solar and wind farms. My job at the Blue Economy CRC is to work with companies, governments, First Nations, community and researchers on growing that blue economy, really focused on seaweed and renewable energy and seafood. So applying that kind of think and take, I wanted to take you through a set of observations when it comes to my engagement in the blue economy globally. Consent, I touched on it before. Everywhere I go, everyone I talk to highlights consent as the biggest barrier to growth, a kaleidoscope of regulations, conditions and standards. Which brings me to literacy. Oceans and ocean industries, they're complex, they are not straightforward. Not everyone knows the ins and outs, and this affects consent and it affects consumer awareness. Innovation, the more profits our industries make, the more they can spend on innovation. Ocean industries are capital expenditure intensive though. You need to understand that that profit, that relationship with innovation, that relationship with sustainability is all linked, and that food system as a whole probably needs to be reset a little bit, which links to siting. Where are these industries going to operate? Where can they grow? Where are they already? Co-location. As space in our oceans and our coasts continues to crowd, what can go together? Can ocean energy and seafood go together? Can we have a bank for food and energy at the same place, or a bank for energy and regenerative aquaculture? Adaptive management, how do we move towards an ocean balance sheet? And I'm not talking just economics here, I'm talking impact. Pluses and minuses, the positive and the negatives. Growth here that underpins like nutrient rebalances or growth here that underpins diversity for jobs and prosperity for local communities. And the other piece here is a blue economy ecosystem, and I'm not talking a scientific ecosystem perspective here, I'm talking the full system, the roadmap, the action plans, the financial plans, the policy, the regulatory reforms, the standards, the levies, that needs to all be looked at together.
Thank you so much, I appreciate that. Marie May, it's wonderful to have a representative from one of the Indian Ocean island countries. We'll welcome your perspective on this topic.
Thank you, Gordon, and good morning, everyone. Such an honor for me to speak to you today and to share a little bit the experiences of Seychelles in our blue economy journey. A lot of the things that the other panelists have touched on really hits home for us. So being a small island developing state, of course, or as we like to consider ourselves, a large ocean state, the oceans, I think it's a no-brainer that the government of Seychelles decided to embark on a blue economy development for the country and for the prosperity of its people. So when we started, I believe really started back in 2013-14, when we started promoting it, for us it became very obvious that blue economy would help us to acknowledge a lot of our small island issues, our dependencies and uniqueness regarding oceans, so our vulnerabilities, including links to climate change and all of that. So it became very clear that we needed to take a comprehensive approach to how we handled the way the country was going. And so we found that it would allow us to diversify our economy, improve our dependency on imports, address issues of limited space that we have on land, but also find a space that will help us to grow capacity for the people of the country. So as you know, critical to small islands, we have very small domestic markets, we have limited natural resources, and we're quite vulnerable to those economic shocks externally. And so through fisheries and tourism, we saw that this space would allow us to grow further in the blue economy, but moving away just from traditional fisheries, but helping people to understand that blue economy could be far more than that. You know, research, innovation, bioprospecting, and other things that traditionally islanders would not be thinking about. We grew up on fisheries, you grew up by the sea, and this is what you would associate. And for a long time when we spoke about blue economy in the Seychelles, this was the notion that people had. And so therefore the country, the government, along with stakeholders, both nationally and internationally, we thought that if we wanted to really spearhead blue economy, we needed to find a way to engage with the public. So taking a whole of society approach that really empowers and promotes ocean stewardship so that people recognize the role that oceans have in their own lives and want to become engaged in that process of managing it. And so that goes just beyond putting in place policies, but that goes out in making resources available to the people. So let the people come up with the ideas of how they manage the oceans, how they engage with the oceans. And this is where the organization that I work with comes in. I work with the Seychelles Conservation and Climate Adaptation Trust, and this is a mechanism that through a public-private setup, the government has worked with partners to create in order to make resources available to the people of Seychelles, to individuals, to organizations, NGOs, and government institutions in all things to do with oceans. So we have three broad pillars, of course, one being biodiversity conservation, because we want to make sure that all the economic development that we're looking towards are going to be done in a way that gives due consideration to the environment. We have a pillar that builds on climate change resilience, so looking at both climate adaptation and mitigation, mindful, of course, that we're a small island developing state and that we're extremely vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, a lot of which we're already feeling. And then finally, to allow a space for businesses and private sector to trial and nurture business ideas that will help us to really achieve the sustainable blue economy that we really want. And so since 2017, we have been putting out calls to our Blue Grants Fund every year, and we support these projects and programs. And very pleased, to date, we have launched 7 cycles. We have funded over 70 projects amounting to over $3.2 million. And this is a big deal for us because we have traditionally depended a lot externally to get funds to support our projects, and to be able to have a trust fund in country that is supporting locals and making them have the confidence to engage in marine protected area management, co-management modalities with government, research, building capacity of local communities and community-based organizations, but also raising awareness at a whole of society approach. You know, producing media, developing new school curriculum for the kids on ocean and sustainable ocean management. So these are things that really are going to set up the country and the people to really take forward the whole aspect of blue economy. But as the ambassador has mentioned, one of the critical challenges remain, of course, the availability of these resources, because SECAT, we have to go outside and we have to get the financial resources to bring back in country to people on the ground who are doing the work. And so this remains a big challenge for us, to accessible and equitable sources of financing that can really help a small country like Seychelles to achieve full prosperity and successful livelihoods for its people.
Thank you very much. That's very inspirational. And also your acronym SECAT is almost as cool as Ocean Swell. We're getting a very good thing. All right, Timothy, we're going to go out of the far side to the western side of the Indian Ocean, the South African perspective.
Thank you very much. I've actually come from Pretoria, which is not exactly renowned as a maritime city. It's 1,000 kilometers inland. I work for an organization called the Institute for Security Studies, which has a Pan-African footprint with offices in Addis Ababa and Nairobi. Again, not exactly renowned for their maritime facilities. But I think it's very important as a way of illustrating some of the principles which have animated not just the work that we try and do and support, among others, but also some of the principles which are featuring in the frameworks and documents which are really providing that crucial navigational chart forward for African member states. And it's wonderful to follow Marie from the Seychelles as well, because I really find that the work the Seychelles has been doing, the example, the leadership, and I think the importance of being a champion is essential, and has actually done a lot of the highlighting and spotlighting, which is going to hopefully play out in the coming years. The reason I wanted to also focus on the footprint of the ISS is partly because of the inclusivity which is essential to blue economy projects. It is not just cross-cutting in terms of maybe overlapping with industries and sectors. It has to be inclusive, not just of these sectors, but of the youth. And the Seychelles has a very, very prominent inclusivity principle when it comes to youth involvement in the blue economy. And as Assistant Minister Watts mentioned earlier, the African continent is going to be effectively one of the youngest, or the youngest continent in the world. There'll be more and more people living along the coastlines. There'll be more and more people migrating to the coastlines, especially if climate change renders inland areas unsustainable to live in. But at the same time, sea level rises and the pressures on sea resources mean that there is not necessarily security along the coastlines, or human security along the coastlines. There is a squeeze, there is a stress which is occurring there. And the answers are going to have to be found from the people who will be there for the future and the long term, designing the plans and the frameworks which are going to benefit them in the future. My colleague at the ISS, David Willimer, is a Zambian researcher, but has not let that be an obstacle to having that ocean focus. He spoke at the Our Ocean conference in Palau several years ago, and at the One Young World event in Manchester in 2022, and put forward a very, very good isiZulu expression called Lalela Uluwanle, which means listen to the oceans. It's also the name of a very good South African theatre company production on stories from ocean communities. It means listen to the oceans. And what he said was, when we listen, we realize that the ocean is telling us it needs healing. So the focus on sustainability and regenerative projects is absolutely critical in this circumstance. And it's not just limited to the coastal countries too. Again, Minister Watts mentioned an interesting Australian policy development of a relationship with Bhutan. Now, I actually made a note of wanting to say that from Burundi to Bhutan, there is no obstacle to maritime development or being inland. And the reason I mentioned Burundi as well is Burundi is located on Lake Tanganyika, which is shared by 4 countries. It is a multinational lake. And even if Burundi is not connected to the Indian Ocean, its trade links, its orientation in terms of its economic partners overseas is in the Indian Ocean. And because it's located on a lake, as are several other countries within the Western Indian Ocean, African coastline, that there are blue economies there as well. There is the cross-cutting potential between inland, lakes, coastal, island states, and partners overseas. Kenya in particular has been a very important champion in this regard as the host and the convener of the Sustainable Blue Economy Conference in 2018, which is what led to the African Union's Blue Economy Strategy. And last year, I think this framework was strengthened by the hosting by the Comoros of the what led to the Moroni Declaration. So the framework of political will and the framework of actions, planned actions, which can have an impact, which have been mapped out and are inclusively designed, is there. But as Marie mentioned, the crucial thing is, I think, the financial resources. There is no shortage of popular will once consciousness is created and supported. And as I say, it was the consciousness of the youth, African youth in particular, which is a major factor to consider. I think I'll leave it at there for now, because I'd love to tackle a few more questions as well.
No, thank you very much. Obviously, when you think about demographics in the future, it's really important to have an African perspective on this conversation. So now back to kind of the center, Sri Lanka. If we could turn to you, Asha, please.
Yeah, absolutely. Good morning, everybody, and thank you so much for having me here. It is an honor to speak on this panel. Really interesting perspectives. The challenge of being the last person on a panel is always to come up with something new and exciting. But I want to start off, I guess, from a personal perspective. One of the things that makes me really uncomfortable about the term blue economy is that we lead with the word exploitation quite often, and I don't think that's a word we should be using. We should be talking about protection of the oceans for sustainable use. And I want to put that out there. I'm sure that I can see nodding, so obviously I'm not alone with this in this thought. But I think the way we define it really leads the way to how we actually act on it. And so I want to open with that. And if we think about the Indian Ocean, it is warming very fast. In the last few decades, we've lost about 30% of our phytoplankton. As we all know, phytoplankton is the base of every food web, right? So the less phytoplankton there is, the less of everything else there is. Between 1950 and 2018, fisheries in the Indian Ocean have increased by 300%. Okay, and this is based on underreported numbers. There's a lot of underreporting in fisheries globally. Getting accurate fisheries data is almost impossible for very, very many reasons. But with that underreporting, we know it's increased by 300%, both small scale and industrial, right? So that's really important for us to remember, because we often think of small scale fisheries as being a more sustainable fishery because it's a small scale fishery, but it's not. We have a lot of vessels going out there. The reason I say these things is because, overfishing is happening. The catch per unit effort is decreasing, right? So more effort is being made to make those catches. So those are clear signs that overfishing is happening in the region. So we know, we've talked about the blue economy for a long time. We've talked about the need for this. But what are our actions? Okay, so there are some countries taking action, right? Hats off to Seychelles for really making an effort and being a champion and really trying to show us how it can be done. But there are lots of parts of our region that aren't taking action, that we engage in these conversations year after year. But what are the pledges we're making? And to me, platforms like this should be used to make those pledges so that we can hold ourselves accountable on global stages. I think that's incredibly important. I think we suffer a lot in this region from sort of limited institutional capacity, weak governance, limited ability to manage the resources. There's resource management conflicts that, we have fisheries, we have conservation, we have, shipping, all of these things. There are resource users conflicts. There are ways to resolve these things, but quite often what happens is decisions are made in silos in all these different areas, and we're not actually coming together to have these conversations. But what are the needs across the board, and how do they benefit or not all the different stakeholders? Because if it benefits only one group and not the other, it is absolutely impossible to have a successful blue economy, right? It's absolutely impossible for us to move forward in a positive manner. In this region, we also have a lot of IUU, right? So that's part of the reason why we have underreporting of figures for fisheries. There is a lot of illegal fisheries, unreported, unregulated fisheries that go on, right? So that's obviously undermining our effort to increase the sustainability of our fisheries. And I don't want to be the negative person in the room. We've heard some really good positive stories. We've heard people talking in a very uplifting manner, but I also want to provide the perspective, the reality of what is going on in this region. I am a scientist, I'm a researcher, I'm a conservationist based in Sri Lanka. I do the work that can make a difference for the policy, but very often, again, the work in silos means there is no space for research, right? Decisions are made at the highest levels, and they're not always evidence-based. They're driven by conversations that happen in a room like this, but they don't engage with the researchers on the ground, the people actually doing the work to say, how can we actually make sure this happens? Because that's where we should be now. I don't know how much longer we can talk about the definition and what it means to have a blue economy. I mean, we've lost a lot of time already. And so I am asking that we think about how do we use these spaces to make commitments, to get people to make pledges, particularly in the higher levels, so that we are starting to see change. And this lack of investment and funding is a crucial factor. All the work I do, my group, we don't get any funding locally, it's all external funding. But that shouldn't be the case. We should have mechanisms in place in our countries to support this endeavor. We cannot depend on the outside constantly, because then partnerships become inequitable, because the power dynamic shifts as money comes from outside. If the money is from within, then it's very, very different. We're talking about equitability, we're talking about inclusivity. None of that's possible unless it's actually coming from within. And so today I'm saying, I think there's lots of things we can talk about, lots of conversations to be had, but how do we start? How do we start now? How do we make sure that everyone's included in the conversation? And how do we ensure that governments are more open to having all the stakeholders to sit at the table to bring what their knowledge and acknowledgement of that existing knowledge and locally available capacity to make sure that we get on the right path? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Asha, and thank you to all the panelists. That was a very rich conversation, and I've got a list of 100 questions already just from your remarks. But I thought I might want to frame something and ask each of you to come back and react to it in the same way. Angela mentioned how even 20, 30 years ago, when we were talking about shrimp on the Barbie, we didn't think collectively about the Indian Ocean. Our conversations today made it really clear that there's a need to think collectively. And yet, if you look at IORA, if you look at many of the discussions we've had now through 7 iterations of the Indian Ocean Conference, one of the challenges is that we all have our own EEZs in the Indian Ocean. We all tend to focus very much on our own EEZs. And even broader than that, you might have a Bay of Bengal kind of initiative where there's things done. You've got some very different issues on the Western Indian Ocean. and from here in the eastern Indian Oceans. And yet, as we know well, climate change doesn't stop at an EEZ. Fisheries don't stop at an EEZ. The other concerns we have, we don't. So there really is this mandate for collective action. And yet, that's underpinned by questions of fairness. From our very first panelist to our last, the question of investment. Who invests in these things came up. So I wonder if I can, again, I'm asking you to summarize the entire panel in one comment, but I'd like to get different perspectives. If you look beyond the borders of the EZ of Sri Lanka, or the Seychelles, or South Africa, or Australia, or India, and you start thinking about the collective, what are the initiatives or actions collectively that most merit investment? And again, Asha, I'm going to start with you and work my way back because you kind of framed that question. So if we assume, and everybody seemed to agree, that we're wasting time, we need to move forward on this, we can't just define the region, the topic of blue economy, there needs to be some collective action that goes beyond our own individual EEZs. What are those and which ones should be funded? So I'll start with you, Asha.
Thank you. So I will start obviously with the idea, the whole aspect of fisheries. Fisheries is possibly the first place to start. And I would like to reference the point that, yes, these lines that we draw that separate these oceans and these EEZs are all imaginary, right? At the end of the day, it's one collective ocean. It's not just the Indian Ocean either. What we do here has ripple effects across the entire ocean, right? And that's something we do have to remember. Fisheries can afford to have focus on it. It is probably the biggest conservation concern in our waters across the world. So we do need to start investing more in that. I would say even marine tourism, it's an up and coming, in some ways, alternative to fisheries, right? So we are asking people to shift towards tourism because it's more sustainable. But it's not just inherently more sustainable. We have to make it more sustainable. We have to think about how it's being done. It's not just, again, about exploitation of a resource. It's about how do we look after that resource into the long term in a way that provides benefits to the local communities and the people, as well as protecting those resources, right? That marine biodiversity that we have and that we are using very freely. But also then when we think about the oceans in terms of shipping, right? I think that's another area because that's a cross-cutting thing, right? Ships go through all our ocean basins. They use all our oceans. So we do need to start thinking about what are the threats that come from this shipping. And I recognize that, 90% of everything is shipped, so we do need shipping in our world, but how is it being done? Are we considering the environmental concerns? We put down shipping lanes at a time, back in the day when we didn't really understand what was in those coastal waters, what species lived in those places, what are the benefits of protecting those areas. Now that we have that knowledge, I think we can do a lot more. So for me, those are areas that we need to invest in. And also those players also need to be investing in doing better.
Fantastic. Timothy?
I think, Angela, you mentioned literacy as an important aspect, and unpacking that a bit, I think, and expanding it towards the encouragement of entrepreneurship. If I take principles which we've observed in some studies from youth peace and security as well as women peace and security, research and policies, and this is taking maybe some lessons from post-conflict societies, but the design of resilient structures, institutions, and societies depends on opening up and encouraging that kind of entrepreneurship and literacy, and through that investment in, if it's outreach, if it's listening to the youth, but also providing them with, as you say, the opportunities to engage in maybe seafaring or maritime activities. I do believe that the coming together of circumstances in the minds of people who want to engage in ocean matters, they will see the opportunities. They will, with the aid of literacy, education, and upliftment in that regard, be able to come up with new economic opportunities, new plans, which will have not just that sustainability and regenerative aspect as well, but I think will be of greater benefit in actually encouraging wider society to also think oceans a lot more. one of the important, I think, industries which is going to play a part in increasing that literacy, but also bringing revenue into countries, is the resurgence of cruise ship tourism. The recent launch, I do not recall the name, but of effectively the largest cruise ship the other day, is interesting, obviously, given its size and dimensions and what it means, but also to understand, is this part of a continual phenomena? COVID-19 really shut down that industry for a while. Many cruise ships were, in fact, I think, laid up and indeed dismantled. But at the same time, there is clearly a growing interest in coming to parts of the world with blue economies and are characterized by those blue aspirations and characteristics, which indeed the whole world would like to do. Balancing that with the pollution aspects, the environmental aspects is critical there too. Thanks.
Thank you. Maria May?
Thank you. I was thinking a little bit sort of in line with what Asha was saying, because I think in terms of a collaborative approach and really pushing forward this one ocean way of looking at things really builds on creating the ability for different people from different countries in the region to engage. And that is often a limitation because not all of the countries have the same capacities in country for them to engage with the space of blue economy. So that would, of course, be the first starting point. Creating those enabling structures that builds capacities within each of the countries of the region for its people to engage with oceans, and therefore then building on aspects of funding innovations, of funding researchers, trialing out new ideas, and allowing people to create alternative livelihoods that shifts them from some of those non-sustainable practices that they might be doing at the moment, for instance, in fishing, sorry. So if there's no way for them to find alternative livelihoods, then likely the likelihood of change is very minimal. And so therefore, this is why we practice a lot of this ocean empowerment and stewardship, really putting people in a space of power where they feel that they can implement change. And this is what the support that we can get from outside should try to do, moving away from just having researchers come in country, do research, and then go away with the know-how. How do we leave that knowledge in country so that people can actually develop that space? And then you will have small actions at local level that would really amount to these global changes, global scale impacts. And so this is really, I feel, the best way in terms of investment that we can have. So looking at research, alternative livelihoods, but also empowerment of the people in the region. Thanks.
Thank you. Angela?
Thank you. So I come from government originally, and then I worked in politics, and then I worked in commercial interests. And now in this job, I try and pull it all together, and maybe this is me atoning for things I did in my past. Decisions that I thought would unlock growth, or decisions that I thought would ensure that we had this balance of growth and conservation. So where I sit today, I want to sort of highlight that there are two different speeds going on in the world, and in our region in particular. One speed is being led by government, and it's the lag, to be honest. The other speed is being led by the investment market. It's the shareholders of those global markets, and they are leading in many ways. They've already defined what they think sustainability looks like. What are those metrics? They're asking the big end of town, if you're a listed company, how are you supposed to report, what your targets are supposed to be. And what we're at right now is this spot, is how do you pull those two things together? How do you bring those speeds together? How do we turn this upside down so that when we're talking about the Indian Ocean, our shareholders are our people, just like in that investment market, who are deciding what matters to them. What are those material sustainability topics to them that then those companies report against? Let's flip it. What matters to our shareholders? And once we know what matters to our stakeholders, our shareholders, our community, then we look at, well, where are we at the moment? What's that state of play? What else is going on? What's being forecast? Actually, where are the solutions to the blue economy that have nothing to do with us? They're around decarbonisation, electrification. And those benefits for those land-based activities will flow back onto here. And the risk, we don't have to take ourselves because someone else is sharing that risk or they're de-risking it for us so that we don't have to choose which alternate, sustainable fuel to take. What's that next thing? The old, are we VHS or beta? Or 10 years later, are we net streaming, streaming services? There are some really big decisions that then influence investment. And so a bit of a blue economy playbook that we write with our community, with our shareholders, with our stakeholders, with our industry, that is much more contemporary and forward-looking, that unites the research, the observations, has those circular economy feedback loops, not just on waste where we hear circular economy, but data and knowledge and funding. How do we pull all that together and pool it? Because knowledge is the new currency. And how do we do that in a way that benefits the different scales of our communities, of our needs, of our expectations across our countries? And then what makes sense for us when we're the fast follower, because Europe's doing it, versus when we want to be the leader and we're going to take that risk ourselves. So in our region, do we want to be the leaders on ocean energy, on waves and tidal that has benefits because then that goes into the microgrids, or that then supports fisheries, or that then does X, Y, and Z? Like, how do we get these things that connect? So I think our investment conversation for the blue economy is we write it ourselves. We work together, we learn, we look at what our points of difference are, and then we understand what else is going on, and we become the leads. Someone else can lag for a little bit, and they can learn from us. But I think the answers are all there. I really genuinely do, but we have to flip it. We have to look at what else is going on, and we have to find those threads, those golden threads, and weave them into our playbook.
Anil?
So Gordon, a lot of points have come up during this discussion, and I just go by the Indian experience where blue economy contributes just about 4% to the Indian economy, which is a very low figure given the fact that we are surrounded on three sides by the ocean. And it's only recently that in India we woke up to the fact there's a lot that can be done to exploit this. But the fact remains that we've also realized that about 60% of the ocean is not under any exclusive economic zone. So therefore we've got to pay attention to that as well. You raised a very important question about financing, because in our first round of discussions, that's what emerged as a crucial point. And I think in India, the thinking seems to be to strengthen the existing international conventions in that regard, because we have many of them. We have conventions on biodiversity on the ocean. We have for pollution, which is under the IMO, for instance, the Biodiversity Convention, the Climate Change Convention, etc. Of course, we have to strengthen them, but the component over there about transfer of technology and creating capacities in the members is important, because it's only then that we will be able to talk about financing and finance transfers. And if you look at the memberships themselves, when you collaborate amongst each other, naturally it will be done not as a collective. You can't have a pool of money which will go into the organization and then be distributed. That's a little impractical. No country would like to do that, and everybody would like to see how the money is then distributed, etc. That's the job of the international banks and institutions like that. But these particular conventions and their organizational structure can actually foster the technological cooperation which creates that capacity and enable them to then utilize the finances which are available around the world to make that work for them. So that's the only solution that we have. But one very other important point which emerged out of this discussion is that we have many stakeholders. So we have to have not only the researchers, the policymakers, but also the industry, all of them involved in this decision-making process.
Well, what a rich set of answers. I'm going to ask just one more question, and I'm not going to go through everybody. Whoever wants to respond to it can, just because you framed the topic very well, from kind of the specific activities, from fishery to tourism to shipping, to the education requirements, literacy, research along that process, to the role of the private sector, shareholders versus government, the clarity of what we're talking about here. We've got EEZs, but you've also got 60% of the ocean that's not under an EEZ. That, by definition, is collective. So the question I would ask you now are, what are the technologies, financing developments, new capacities that we should be aware of going forward? Because, again, if you look back 20, 30 years ago, the Indian Ocean was kind of a blank space. We didn't know a lot. We didn't have the projection capability to get out into that 60%. But if we understand that there's some real concerns of unregulated, illegal fishing, a lot of concern about illegal activities, there are a lot of new technologies which are going to give us a lot more visibility than we had before. Presumably through shelters, there's new financing. There's capacity. 10 years ago, India's capacity to assert an interest in the Indian Ocean was very different than it is today. So that's my question. What are the areas where we ought to be looking forward? What are the new capacities, the new channels of financing, the new technologies that it will enable that collective activity you've been talking about? So any of you can start. Anil, you grabbed the microphone. Do you want to kick off that one?
Okay, I'll just add to what I said earlier. I think in all these fields that you mentioned, Gordon, there are new technologies and capabilities which have evolved over the years. What we have today, you rightly said, is much more than what we used to have a few years ago. If you just take a decade back, we hardly had any of these capabilities around. But let's start with fisheries, which is the most important and common to all the littoral states. Now, and that's also something on which a lot of livelihoods depend. And now here you have a lot of technologies which are sort of self-sustaining, creating sustainability in the industry. We have technologies now where you can actually create your own, you can create your own capacities, double them if you want to, by actually putting in more efforts into doing that, and also making it more cleaner. So that's one. In tourism, you have sustainability, which has come into the industry. It's become very conscious of that, and that goes together with urbanization, port infrastructure, etc., where you have the green element, which has come into the running of ports, etc. Quad, for instance, is now focusing a lot on this particular aspect, but that's only for the Quad countries. And that's why I come back to my point about capability and technology transfers from those who have the capacity to those who don't have it. Only if you spread it around will you be able to eventually then tackle your common goal, which is of climate change. Then you also have ocean services, which has developed as an industry. So if a fisherman, for example, goes out into the sea, what is going to help that person locate the fish and also come back home safely in a certain period of time becomes very important, which never used to exist earlier. But now we have all that capability. So therefore, we have to have each of the players, the stakeholders. It's not just the government or the policymakers, but also the industry and the researchers, as Asha pointed out, for instance, involve all of them into that particular decision making. And I already talked about the financing part. I think it's important to create the capability to transfer technology and to get people together so that they can make use of financial institutions.
Your comments make it very clear that there's a tension between new technologies and capabilities and the sustainability aspect. Because there's a sense of, it seems like fairness in the old days, and if you've got too much technology, the fish don't really have a chance anymore in terms of that process. Really interesting. Marie, I want to actually go to you, specifically because my director of research, my colleague Dr. Kate O'Shaughnessy, who you're going to hear a lot from in the next couple of days, was Australia's High Commissioner to Mauritius and the Seychelles, and she was quite impressed with your Blue Bonds initiative. And that may be what you were talking about in terms of your, but I wanted to make sure that was the case in terms of financing.
Yes, so in order for us to support the transition to the blue economy, so Seychelles adopted some innovative blended finance mechanisms. So it first included the debt for nature swap through TNC and the government of Seychelles that allowed us to refinance some debt, but also in 2018 we were able to launch the first world sovereign blue bond. And it was very targeted at helping locals transition away from unsustainable fishing practices, exploring new avenues, for instance, aquaculture, but also all the businesses in this space. And this is where we were able to get most of the proceeds that we administer through the Blue Grants Fund. So through these two mechanisms, this is where we've been able to set aside about $700,000 every year that goes into our calls for proposals, and that we fund the projects. A lot of them are related to research and the technology. So contingent in all of these deals, we have been running a marine spatial planning process in the Seychelles that's fully supported by these proceeds. And our marine spatial plan in itself addresses a lot of the issues that we're talking about today here, about engagement, inclusivity. How do we include everybody from the local community, understanding what they need, but also allowing them a voice in the decision-making process as we grow the blue economy sector. So that helps, but also our marine spatial plan has helped us with the research arm, so understanding really what are the gaps that the Seychelles has as a country, in terms of understanding what we have, how to manage it, but also climate proofing it, understanding how the seas are changing, how it's going to affect fish stocks, how we're going to, all of that is embedded in our marine spatial plan. And one of the critical gaps that we've seen are around technologies. A lot of the sort of MCS, which is your monitoring, control, and surveillance technologies that we would need to invest in, they're quite expensive. So the implementation of the plan is going to be very critical for us. So looking at technologies, how do we get access to some of those technologies? How do we maintain it? How do we make sure that the knowledge that we're acquiring from these technologies and the research gets down to the level where it actually matters to help us with the decision making? So like the ambassador is saying, it's good and well to have the technologies, but it has to be in the right hands so that it actually has the impact that we want it to have. But also, how do we sustain it in the long term? Who funds for maintaining and acquiring new technologies continuously to help the fishers and everybody in the country?
Thank you. Asha?
Yeah, so I want to follow on from both those comments, actually. So if we talk, again, we're focusing very much on fisheries because it clearly shows that it's an area that needs a more effort. So in Sri Lanka, we do some research. I have a student who's doing research on fishermen from Sri Lanka who cross borders and illegally fish in other people's waters. And we talk about new technologies, and we're talking about monitoring and surveillance, right? So there are problems around things like VMS. It exists. It could be a safety tool, but when we talk to the fishermen, we understand that they are not comfortable being watched, let's say. And that goes back to, it shows us the mistrust with government, right? And if there's mistrust of government, it just goes to show that the government is not addressing the needs of these fishermen or not listening and including them in this policy-making process, which is why they are not willing to use these technologies. So having new technologies is wonderful, but if it's not being used, if the right stakeholders are not brought into the room and you're not having that conversation about the value of it, they don't see it as something that helps their safety. They see it as a way to be watched, and they don't want to be watched, which is understandable, right, from their perspective. So I think we need to consider that as well. So it's great to celebrate new technologies, but what does that do for the people who are actually involved in these activities? And how do we make them feel comfortable to understand that it's not about shutting them down all the time, it's about trying to figure out what they're doing. So our research really is trying to get the perspective of fishermen to understand why some of the policies that are in place don't actually work, because we want to be able to make policies that work. We can't make policies that work if they're being discussed in a closed room, unless we're actually talking to the fishermen and understanding their needs. And if we talk about, capacities and new capacities, I think we have to go back to the whole idea of ocean literacy, right? We need fundamental capacities. It just doesn't exist. I'm not that old. I'm just going to say that out loud, but the reason I say that is because when I started on this journey and I told people in Sri Lanka, I want to be a marine biologist, people laughed at me. They were like, what are you going to do with that degree? How is it useful? I mean, any of you know, Sri Lanka is a beautiful tropical island in the middle of the Indian Ocean. We have jurisdiction of 8 times more ocean area than land area. But that was the perspective, right? And so today, it has changed because a lot of the work that I do is about making sure that we have in-house capacity so that we can lead the charge on our own issues, there are our own challenges, because the people who live and breathe those challenges are always best placed to address those challenges. We work in the ocean literacy space. We're not always welcome, right? In the sense of that there are blocks for us to get engaged from the government side, but I think there's so much to be done. Our textbooks talk nothing about the monsoons, which is the fundamental driver of everything that happens in our region, in our country, right? Why is that not part of it? So we can talk about, again, new capacities, but we need to go back to what capacity exists. What do people know? How do we create that stewardship, right? How do we allow people to feel that they can be part of the solution and not constantly part of the problem and having fingers pointed at them? And so the work that we do has been very much about that, and it's about that inclusivity. And I actually just wrote a piece for the New York Times in December called "The Oceans Are Diverse, the Champions should be too." And I'd ask you all to read that because it really emphasizes the need for us to become better at empowering people locally to be able to lead the problems of our oceans. We talk about challenges and issues and problems, overfishing, this, that, everything, but that largely exists because there are systemic problems that allow those things to happen. Systemic problems of inequity, systemic problems about where like money is coming from, how it's used, what kind of power imbalances that creates. If we can resolve those things, then we can resolve these end product problems, right? Which is like overfishing, pollution, things like that. So I talk a lot about fixing systemic problems because to me, if we're not thinking about that, if we're not being inclusive and equitable and making sure everybody has the capacity to be part of that solution, then we're not going to survive. We're not going to succeed. And that's it. That's the reality.
Thank you, Angela, and then we'll go to Timothy at the last.
I guess for me, there's a couple different ways of looking at it. And again, like you can tell, I'm the one that's wearing a bit of a commercial market-based hat at the table. But I think that actually it's not about the dollars in the first instance, it's about the people, and it's about creating a blue economy workforce for the region that are empowered to be able to work across different sectors, that are skilled and proud of what it is that they're doing and how they contribute. And so that as new and emerging industries or transitioning industries come into play, that there is already a workforce readiness and acceptability for being able to support these additions of the blue economy. So I think that you can have companies that come in, or an industry that comes in, or a government has a readiness program or a policy and they're calling for something, but it means zilch if there is no actual workforce who can join and be able to participate in that. So I think that part of that is the literacy piece, part of that is pride. We want people to be proud about what they're doing. Yes, there is a history of some unsustainable practices here that sits sort of underneath the dark kind of belly of this kind of concept, but at the same time I sit there and I go, there are all these really great achievements, so how do we also reward success in the blue economy industries, because that reward of success then flows into investor comfort, into lender comfort, and so it's like a bit of a cycle there. I also think that we should be looking at the environment as a bit more of a natural bank of sorts. So how do you have areas that are, as I said, food bank, energy bank, bring it down to base human principles? Like what are some of those things that we want to, reimagine our ocean to be able to contribute? And from that perspective, I think it really is about sharing, like providing an investment readiness framework that has already de-risked some of these activities, or at least shares that risk, so as people go along and provide that contribution towards what it is we're talking about, that there is some level of understanding the return. Big companies are going to play a really important role in the nature kind of biodiversity market that's developed. However, how does that then translate to your small and medium enterprises and your micros and nanos? And the reality is, if there is no direct reward or benefit or price differentiation, it's really hard to convince change. So I think that there needs to be, I stand by, readiness for your workforce, pride and confidence in what these blue economy industries can deliver and why they are more important. There is a really unique bit about the Indian Ocean. I think we can lead on some things globally. I really genuinely do. I point to ocean energy. I think there is something there. Create the manufacturing supply chain. create some competitive tension amongst ourselves, and also create these renewable grids that can then, help support the electrification, the reduction of diesel, elimination of diesel, and then benefit from those market offerings as well. So, yeah.
Oh, thank you. Timothy.
Thanks. I started off by thinking or embracing one of the things you said earlier, Gordon, during your opening remarks about blue skies thinking. And what I was ended up getting to was thinking about how can we avoid people feeling blue about the blue economy prospects. And the reason I got to that point was, again, forgive me for trying to always find a maritime metaphor, but the equivalent of the elephant in the room, the whale in the swimming pool, or the hippo in the swimming pool, or something, was about whether we've reached several tipping points. We always talk about the tipping points of the 1.5 and the oceans, but the tipping point now of AI and that innovation, it seems that never again will we not have AI involved in some kind of decision-making process or in some kind of policy-making or thinking from here on. And what that means is the imperative for people to be skilled or technologically literate as well as ocean literate is something which is challenging enough, I think, in places like Australia and South Africa or countries like Japan or the United States, but especially difficult for most African countries, and indeed smaller countries around the world, where we have to be very responsive. Is it on? Sorry, maybe it's because I keep moving it around. Very reactive to changes occurring all around the world. And the reason I said about feeling blue is the imperative for education, for the opening up of inclusive opportunities for youth to contribute and design their future is got to be balanced with will there be fewer employment opportunities because traditional activities are no longer part of the overall occupation. There's no point training a seafaring workforce for a future where there is no seafaring because of automation or crewless vessels. Again, these are long-term questions. I know that they're not easy to answer now. They're things which I think, in terms of the blue skies approach, I think have really come out of what I've been thinking and listening to the discussions today, because those are very.
Just keep going; it'll come.
Those are very long-term challenges, and then there are no easy answers, but they're gonna have to feature as part of our plans. Thanks.
Oh, thank you so much.